On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito told the Japanese people that the war had ended because the enemy had begun to use a new and most cruel bomb, a weapon whose power to do damage was incalculable. 2 days later, on August 17th, the same emperor issued a second rescript, addressed this time not to the civilian population but to the armed forces, and in that document Hirohito gave an entirely different reason. The rescript to soldiers and sailors cited the entry of the Soviet Union into the war. Same monarch, same surrender, same week, and two separate explanations aimed at two separate audiences, 48 hours apart. That divergence is not a footnote. It sits at the center of one of the most contested arguments in the history of the Second World War, an argument that has run for 80 years across American, Japanese, and Russian archives without ever reaching a settlement. The question is simple to state and brutally difficult to answer. Did the atomic bombs end the Pacific War, or did the Soviet Union? This is the story of what happened inside the Japanese government between August 6 and August 14, 1945, the 8 days in which an empire that had sworn to fight to the last man decided instead to stop. It is also the story of why historians who have read the same documents, in the same languages, drawn from the same archives, still cannot agree on what those 8 days actually prove. We are going to do something unusual with this material. We are not going to resolve it. The evidence does not permit a clean verdict, and anyone offering you one is selling a version of the past that is tidier than the past ever was. To understand why the question resists an answer, you first have to understand that the phrase Japan surrendered conceals a machine. No single decision maker existed in Tokyo in August of 1945. Supreme authority formally rested with the emperor, but the actual work of deciding fell to the government and to a body called the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, known then and ever since as the Big Six. The six were Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro, Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori, Army Minister Anami Korechika, Navy Minister Yanai Mitsumasa, Army Chief of Staff Yamizu Yoshijiro, and Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda Somo. Decisions inside the Supreme Council required consensus and not a majority. Unanimity. Any one of those 6 men could halt the entire machine by the simple act of refusing to agree. The machine carried a second lock as well. Both the Army and Navy ministers had to be serving officers, which meant either service branch could collapse any cabinet in Japan by withdrawing its minister and declining to nominate a replacement. That power was never theoretical. It stood as the permanent structural fact of Japanese politics, and every member of the Suzuki cabinet understood exactly what it meant. Anyone who has worked in software architecture will already recognize this arrangement. What Japan had built was a distributed system with a unanimous commit requirement and no timeout. Every node has to agree before the transaction goes through, and no mechanism exists to evict a node that refuses. Modern engineers abandoned that design decades ago because they learned what it reliably produces, which is not careful decisions but paralysis. A single holdout does not merely slow such a system down. A single holdout freezes it indefinitely, and Japan in 1945 was running its national survival on precisely that architecture. By August of 1945, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War had split 3 against 3. The peace faction, made up of Suzuki, Togo, and Yanai, stood ready to accept the Allied terms with one condition attached, which was the preservation of the imperial institution. The war faction, made up of Anami, Yamizu, and Toyota, demanded 3 further conditions on top of that one. No Allied occupation of the home islands. Japan would disarm its own forces. Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials, 3 against 3, with unanimity required, and no tiebreaker anywhere in the system. Hold that in your head for the rest of this account, because it reshapes the question entirely. The question is not what convinced Japan to surrender. The question runs far narrower and far stranger than that. Something had to move Anami Korechika, Yamizu Yoshijiro, and Toyoda Somo, 3 men who had staked their professional lives and their personal honor on continued resistance, off a position they had held for months. Any answer to the surrender question has to explain that specific movement in those specific men, not the mood of the country, and not the objective military balance. Those 3 officers, in that room, during that week. Here is the second thing that makes the question hard. By August of 1945, the destruction of Japanese cities was not news to anyone in the Japanese government. Destruction had become routine. The naval blockade had already finished its work. The submarine campaign, combined with the aerial mining operation codenamed Starvation, had severed Japan's maritime imports. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded afterward that the blockade had strangled a country totally dependent on imported fuel. Shipping lay devastated. Food shortages had turned acute, and survey staff recorded, without qualification, that people were starving. Then came the fire. On the night of March 9th into the morning of March 10th, 1945, the 21st Bomber Command flew Operation Meeting House against Tokyo. Somewhere between 279 and 334 B-29 bombers dropped roughly 1,665 tons of incendiaries onto the city. The death toll from that single night remains contested, and the contest itself teaches you something. Britannica gives at least 80,000 and states the figure was likely more than 100,000. Most common estimates cluster between 90,000 and over 100,000. The official Japanese figure, recorded in LeMay's own tactical mission report and preserved in the National Security Archive collection, came to 83,793. Over 1 million people lost their homes, and roughly 16 square miles of Tokyo burned. Notice what that means. The single most destructive air attack in history, by most measures, killed more people in one night than either atomic bomb killed on the day it fell. Tokyo was also not a single event. Japanese police statistics, cited by the historian Mark Selden, record that the 65 raids on Tokyo between December 6, 1944 and August 13, 1945 produced 137,582 casualties, destroyed 787,145 homes and buildings, and displaced 2,625,279 people. Scale that across the country. Working from strategic bombing survey figures, Selden records that the bombing destroyed 40% of the 66 Japanese cities targeted, and that total tonnage dropped on Japan climbed from 13,800 tons in March to 42,700 tons in July. Selden also cites Sir Conwayland's calculation that firebombing destroyed 180 square miles across 67 cities, killed more than 300,000 people, and injured a further 400,000. Read that last set of numbers again, and then hold it against what came next. More than 300,000 dead by conventional incendiary bombing across 67 cities before a single atomic weapon was ever used. The men of the Supreme Council knew all of this. They had been living inside it for 5 months. Enemy Korechika required no briefing to understand that Japanese cities could be erased from the air, because enemy had watched it happen 67 times and had gone on arguing for continued war. That is the baseline problem. Any argument that the atomic bomb was decisive has to explain what made destroyed city number 68 categorically different from destroyed cities 1 through 67. And it has to explain that difference to a group of men who had already absorbed the first 67 without shifting position. Serious historians think that difference is real and explicable. Equally serious historians think it is nothing of the kind. We will get to both. The standard popular account treats the Japanese refusal to surrender in mid-1945 as fanaticism, a death cult marching toward national suicide. That account is comfortable, and it is largely wrong, and understanding why it is wrong forms the precondition for understanding August. The Japanese leadership had a plan. The plan was called Ketsugo, and it amounted to a rational response to the specific strategic position Japan occupied. Ketsugo was the homeland defense strategy, and its logic was never military victory, since nobody in Tokyo in 1945 believed Japan could defeat the United States on the battlefield. Its logic was cost imposition. Japanese planners concentrated forces on Kyushu, correctly identifying it as the likely first landing point, intending to inflict casualties on the initial American assault heavy enough that the United States would prefer a negotiated settlement to the price of continuing. The American Operation Ketsugo was built to bleed existed and had a date. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, was set for November 1, 1945. Olympic formed the first phase of Operation Downfall. The second phase, Operation Coronet, aimed at the Kanto Plain, was slated for the spring of 1946. The strategic logic underneath Ketsugo is not exotic. It is the same logic governing any asymmetric contest in which one side cannot win outright, but can raise the opponent's cost past the point of political tolerance. It appears in insurgency theory. It appears in modern cybersecurity, where a defender who cannot keep an attacker out entirely concentrates instead on making the intrusion expensive enough that the attacker reallocates to a softer target. Japan in 1945 was not planning to win. Japan was planning to make winning cost more than the United States was willing to pay for the terms it was demanding. Whether that plan would have worked remains a genuine open question. Whether it was crazy is not. It was a coherent theory of victory by exhaustion, held by professional officers reading their own strategic position. But Ketsugo rested on a foundation, and that foundation was not military. It was diplomatic. Ketsugo required Soviet neutrality. Japan and the Soviet Union had signed a neutrality pact in April of 1941. As long as that pact held, Japan could strip forces from the Asian mainland and concentrate them on the home islands. As long as that pact held, Japan faced one enemy rather than two. And as long as that pact held, there existed a diplomatic channel, a great power not at war with Japan, capable of brokering terms with the Allies. Every element of Japanese strategy in the summer of 1945 ran through Moscow. The military plan required Soviet neutrality. The diplomatic plan required Soviet mediation. Both plans, the fighting plan and the talking plan, rested on one identical assumption. The Guandong Army in Manchuria operated on exactly this premise. Its plans were purely defensive, built on the belief that the Soviets would not attack before the spring of 1946. Hikosaburo, the Guandong Army Chief of Staff, testified after the war that the command believed it could count on Soviet neutrality until the following spring. Remember that word. Not hoped, believed, planned around, and built the defense of the empire's continental holdings upon. On April 5, 1945, Molotov informed Japan that the Soviet Union would not renew the neutrality pact. Technically, the pact stayed in force for another year. The signal was unmistakable to anyone reading it clearly, and Tokyo, for reasons we are about to reach, did not read it clearly. Between July 12 and July 27, 1945, Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori conducted one of the most closely documented diplomatic failures of the entire war. Togo cabled Ambassador Sato Naotake in Moscow with instructions to sound out the Soviet government about mediating a peace. The proposal centered on sending Prince Kono Fumimaro to Moscow as a special envoy carrying the emperor's personal authority. The Soviets stalled, and they stalled because Stalin had already committed at Yalta, in February of 1945, to enter the war against Japan roughly 3 months after the defeat of Germany. Germany surrendered on May 8. 3 months from May 8 lands on August 8. The Soviet position was fixed before Togo's first cable ever left the building. What makes this exchange extraordinary is that the United States was reading it in real time. American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese diplomatic traffic, and the decrypts, known as magic, circulated at the highest levels of the American government. Truman, Burns, and Stimson were reading the Japanese Foreign Ministry's private correspondence about surrender terms while they sat at Potsdam, deciding what terms to offer. The content of that traffic forms the single most contested body of evidence in this entire debate, so let us read it precisely. On July 17, 1945, Togo cabled Sato that Japan was not seeking Soviet mediation for anything resembling an unconditional surrender. On July 21, Togo turned blunter, writing that Japan could not accept unconditional surrender in any situation. Around July 31, Sato, the ambassador on the ground watching the Soviets refuse to engage, cabled back with a warning that reads today like a man shouting into a sealed room. Sato wrote that there was no alternative but immediate unconditional surrender, and told his own foreign minister that Togo's view and the actual situation might be seen as absolutely contradictory. Sato had stressed earlier that the fundamental character of the nation, the Kokutai, was the one point Japan could not negotiate away. Sit with Sato Naotake for a moment. Here is a professional diplomat in Moscow, denied access, stonewalled by a government he suspects is already preparing to invade, cabling his own capital to say that the strategy he has been ordered to execute rests on a fantasy and being ignored. Sato Naotake was right about every element of it. Sato Naotake was overruled. Now hold both sides of that cable traffic at once, because this is where the historiographical fight begins. The revisionist reading of magic runs like this. The United States knew Japan was seeking peace, knew the sole obstacle was the status of the emperor, and dropped atomic bombs anyway. The orthodox reading of the identical traffic answers by pointing at the actual words. Togo, on July 21st, ruled out unconditional surrender in any situation. The Japanese government was not seeking surrender. The Japanese government was seeking a mediated settlement on terms the Allies had already publicly refused, and treating those two things as the same thing is the central error of the revisionist case. Both readings come from identical documents. That is not a failure of scholarship. That is what genuinely ambiguous evidence looks like. The Potsdam Conference ran from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945. One day before it opened, on July 16th, the Trinity test detonated the first nuclear device in New Mexico. On July 26th, the United States, the United Kingdom, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration. The declaration demanded the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, threatened prompt and utter destruction, and promised that the Japanese people would not be enslaved. And it offered no explicit guarantee regarding retention of the emperor. That omission was not accidental. An earlier draft contained a paragraph offering assurance about the imperial institution, and that paragraph was removed before the declaration went out. Consider what the removal did to the Japanese decision architecture described earlier. The peace faction inside the Big Six stood ready to accept Allied terms on one condition: the preservation of the imperial institution. The Potsdam Declaration fell silent on precisely that point. The one thing capable of breaking the 3-against-3 deadlock in Tokyo was the one thing the document declined to say. American officials argued for keeping that assurance in. Joseph Grew, Under-Secretary of State, who had served as ambassador to Japan and understood the imperial institution's role better than almost anyone in Washington, favored it. Secretary of War Henry Stimson favored it. Ralph Bard, the Navy Undersecretary, dissented from the prevailing line. They lost the argument. Anyone who has run a negotiation professionally will recognize the structure of what happened here. The Allies issued a demand that was maximalist in its language and ambiguous on the counterparty's single non-negotiable interest. That combination is the worst of both worlds in bargaining theory. Maximalist language hardens the other side's resistance, while ambiguity on the core interest denies them the one assurance capable of producing movement. The Potsdam Declaration was, in the technical sense, badly designed as an instrument for producing a decision, and the people who understood the counterparty best were the people who said so at the time and were overruled. 2 days later, on July 28th, Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro made a public statement about the declaration using the word mokusatsu. You have almost certainly encountered the story that follows, since it ranks among the most widely circulated anecdotes in 20th century history. The story holds that mokusatsu was mistranslated, that Suzuki meant merely no comment, that a translator's error read in Washington as contemptuous rejection, and that a single ambiguous Japanese word ended up causing the atomic bombing of 2 cities. That story does not survive contact with the scholarship. The word itself carries genuine ambiguity. Mokusatsu can mean withholding comment or taking no notice. It can also mean treating something with silent contempt, ignoring it deliberately. But the historian Brian P. Walsh, writing in the Pacific Historical Review in 2025 in an article titled Mokusatsu Revisited, argues that Suzuki did in fact announce a rejection and describes the mistranslation story as untenable, if not absurd. Walsh traces the origin of the myth to Kazuo Kawai in 1950. It was popularized later by a 1968 piece in the NSA Technical Journal titled Mokusatsu, One Word, Two Lessons, which is where most modern retellings ultimately come from. Treat that 1968 article as a cautionary example of how myths propagate through institutional channels. Do not treat it as authority. The Mokusatsu story survives because it offers something the actual history refuses to provide, which is a small, fixable, almost accidental cause for an enormous outcome. It lets the bombing become a tragic misunderstanding rather than a decision, and the evidence does not support that comfort. On the morning of August 6, 1945, at approximately 8:15 local time, the weapon-designated Little Boy detonated over Hiroshima with a yield of roughly 15 kilotons. The casualty figures need careful handling, because how you count the dead at Hiroshima turns out to be entangled with what you are arguing about the bomb. Alex Wellerstein, writing for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist in 2020, notes that estimates cluster into two distinct groups. The low estimates, issued by the American government and military during the 1940s, give roughly 70,000 dead at Hiroshima and roughly 40,000 at Nagasaki, about 110,000 in total. The high estimates, produced by Japanese and international scientists during a re-estimation in the 1970s, give roughly 140,000 dead at Hiroshima and roughly 70,000 at Nagasaki, about 210,000 total, with a margin of around 10,000 per city. Those higher figures incorporate populations the earlier counts left out, including Korean forced laborers, commuters, and others outside the registered resident rolls. The Manhattan Engineered District Survey itself acknowledged wide discrepancies. Stafford Warren, who led the Manhattan Project medical team, told Congress the figures amounted to more than a guess. Britannica cites approximately 210,000 total deaths across both cities by the end of 1945, which is a high group figure. Wellerstein's methodological warning deserves stating directly, since it applies to everything else in this account. The low numbers cluster in sources emphasizing military necessity. The high numbers cluster in sources emphasizing victim suffering. Wellerstein's conclusion is that if your argument depends on one particular set of these numbers being the correct set to use, the argument probably needs more thought. Now here is the fact that reorganizes this entire subject, and it is the fact most popular treatments leave out. After Hiroshima, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War did not meet. Not on August 6th, not on August 7th, and not on August 8th. The most powerful weapon in the history of warfare destroyed a Japanese city, and the body required to reach unanimous consent before the war could end never convened. Two readings of that silence exist, and the one you choose largely determines which side of this debate you land on. Sadao Asada, whose work we reach in detail shortly, calls the delay criminal, the failure of a paralyzed leadership to grasp what had happened to them. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa reads the identical laxity as evidence of something else entirely, that the Japanese leadership never treated the atomic bomb as a decisive break in the war at all. Not because those men were stupid or paralyzed, but because within their frame of reference, another destroyed city carried no new information. Genuine uncertainty about what had happened also played a part. A 7-man Imperial Army investigation team, including the physicist Nishina Yoshio, traveled to Hiroshima to assess the weapon, and inside the leadership real internal debate ran over whether it was truly an atomic device, and more consequentially, over how many more the Americans might possess. That second question mattered enormously. Japanese leaders argued about the size of the American stockpile, and some argued the United States could not have many. They were arguing in ignorance of the actual answer. General Groves sent Marshall a memo on August 10, 1945 stating that a third implosion bomb would be ready to ship on August 12th or 13th and usable at the first suitable weather after the 17th or 18th. The Groves production schedule memo of July 30th projected roughly 3 bombs in August, rising to more per month thereafter. Marshall annotated the August 10th memo to specify that no third bomb was to be used without express authority from the president. Truman had effectively halted further atomic bombing, pending a Japanese response. So on both sides of the Pacific, men were making decisions of enormous consequence on the basis of information the other side would have paid almost anything to obtain. The Japanese did not know a third course sat days away. The Americans did not know the Supreme Council had never met. Everything in this argument comes down to a single day and to the order in which news arrived in Tokyo on that day. On August 8, 1945, Molotov informed Ambassador Sato Naotake that the Soviet Union was declaring war on Japan, effective the following day. Sato Naotake, the same ambassador who had spent weeks warning Tokyo that this strategy rested on nothing, received the news personally from Molotov in Moscow. After midnight on August 9th, Transbaikal time, Soviet forces crossed into Manchuria. The Manchurian strategic offensive, known in the literature as August Storm, had begun. The scale of it deserves precise statement, because the Japanese leadership grasped that scale faster than it had grasped anything about Hiroshima. Drawing on David Glantz's studies and standard references, Soviet forces committed to the operation numbered approximately 1.5 to 1.6 million men, with one detailed figure giving 1,577,725, organized in roughly 80 to 89 divisions, with approximately 3,700 tanks and self-propelled guns. One accounting giving 3,704 tanks, plus 1,852 self-propelled guns, alongside roughly 26 to 27,000 artillery pieces and around 3,700 aircraft, deployed across a front of roughly 3,000 miles. Marshal Vasilevsky held overall command, with fronts under Malinovsky, Meretskov, and Perkiev. Against that stood the Guandong Army, nominally somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million men, severely degraded by 1945, its best units and equipment stripped away for the Pacific campaigns. One commonly cited comparison gives the Guandong Army roughly 700,000 men, roughly 200 tanks, and roughly 200 aircraft. 200 tanks against 3,700. 200 aircraft against 3,700. Across a 3,000-mile front, against a plan built on the assumption that this attack would not arrive until spring. Now the timing. Tokyo learned of the Soviet invasion during the night of August 8th into August 9th. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War convened on the morning of August 9th. The Nagasaki bomb, Fat Man, with a yield of roughly 21 kilotons, detonated at approximately 11:02 local time on August 9th. News of that bombing reached the Big Six while the meeting was already underway. Read that order one more time. Hiroshima brought no meeting. The Soviet invasion brought a meeting. Nagasaki arrived as news, mid-meeting, into a room already sitting because of the Soviets. This is the evidentiary hinge of Hasegawa's entire thesis. In his reading, the Soviet entry rather than the second atomic bomb precipitated the crisis meeting, and news of Nagasaki had no effect on a discussion already in progress. One more detail about Nagasaki belongs here, because it cuts against every narrative treating the second bombing as a deliberate escalating signal. Nagasaki was not the primary target. The primary target was Kakura, and Kakura sat obscured by cloud and smoke, so Boxcar diverted. Nagasaki's population had already been partly reduced by earlier evacuations. The second atomic bombing in history hit the city it hit because of weather. Set the moral question aside for a moment and think purely in terms of Japanese strategic calculation on the morning of August 9th, because the mechanism matters more than the body count. Recall the structure from earlier. Japan had two strategies running in parallel. Ketsugo, the military plan, required Soviet neutrality so that forces could concentrate on Kyushu and a decisive defensive battle could be fought against a single enemy. The Moscow Gambit, the diplomatic plan, required Soviet mediation to obtain terms better than unconditional surrender. The Soviet declaration of war destroyed both strategies with one action, not sequentially, but simultaneously. The military plan lost its foundational assumption in the same hour the diplomatic plan lost its only channel, and a third consequence arrived alongside them, which was the prospect of a Soviet occupation zone in a defeated Japan, carrying everything that implied for the survival of the political order the leadership was trying to preserve. Systems engineering has a specific term for what Japan had built, a single point of failure serving two independent critical functions. Both the primary system and the backup ran through the same component. Any competent modern infrastructure review flags that configuration immediately because it produces a particular failure mode, not degradation, but simultaneous total loss of primary and contingency. When Moscow moved, Japan did not lose one option and fall back on the other. Japan lost the plan and the fallback in the same instant, because they had never actually been independent. That is the structural argument for the Soviet entry being decisive. It is not that the Red Army frightened Tokyo more than a nuclear weapon did. It is that the Red Army's movement invalidated the entire architecture of Japanese strategy in a way the destruction of another city, however horrific, did not. Now hold the counterargument in view at the same time, because it carries real force. The counterargument runs like this. The Soviet invasion was a catastrophe on the Asian mainland, and the mainland was not the home islands. Ketsugo was a plan for defending Kyushu, and Soviet armies in Manchuria were not going to land on Kyushu in November. If the Japanese leadership was genuinely committed to the decisive homeland battle, the loss of Manchuria, territory already effectively written off in their defensive planning, should not have overturned the plan. Something else had to be doing the work, and the Orthodox school says the something else was the bomb. The Supreme Council met through August 9th and reached no agreement. 3 against 3, exactly as before, with the peace faction holding to a single condition and the war faction holding to 4. Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro then did something without precedent in modern Japanese governance. Suzuki carried the deadlock to the emperor and asked him to decide. At the Imperial Conference on the night of August 9th into August 10th, Hirohito broke the tie in favor of accepting the Potsdam Declaration with the single condition regarding the imperial prerogative. This is the Seiden, the sacred decision. On August 10th, Japan transmitted its conditional acceptance. On August 11th, the Allied reply came back. Drafted by Secretary of State James Burns, it is known as the Burns Note, and it is a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. The note stated that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, and that the ultimate form of government would be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. Read that as a Japanese official in August of 1945 trying to determine whether the imperial institution survives. The note does not say the emperor is deposed. The note does not say the emperor is retained. The note says the emperor is subordinate, and that the future of the system will be decided by popular will at some unspecified later date. The Burns Note split the Japanese leadership all over again, and the second split ran worse than the first, because the peace faction had now staked its position on a guarantee it could not demonstrate it had received. A second imperial conference convened on August 14th. Hirohito confirmed acceptance, and the rescript was signed. Regarding what the emperor actually said inside those rooms, care is required, because the post-war record was shaped by men who had reasons to shape it. Hasegawa, reading the Kido diary alongside the accounts of the marshals, records that when the question of preserving the Kokutai came up on August 14th, the emperor responded that the enemy had guaranteed the imperial house would be maintained. Hasegawa argues something sharper about the record itself, which is that Kido Koichi, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, worked assiduously after the war to create the myth that the emperor had played a decisive role in ending it. The same caution applies to the emperor's own account. The 1946 dictated document known as the Showa Tenno Roku, the monologue, is treated by scholars as largely self-exculpatory, shaped during the occupation to protect the emperor from questions of war responsibility. The surrender was not yet safe. On the night of August 14th into the 15th, army officers attempted a coup. The plot, led by Major Hatanaka Kenji with Lieutenant Colonel Takeshita Masahiko among the plotters, aimed to seize the recordings of the surrender rescript and prevent the broadcast. It failed by dawn, and Hatanaka killed himself. Army Minister Anami Korechika, the man whose consent had been structurally necessary and had been withheld for months, committed seppuku on the morning of August 15th. A suicide note is commonly rendered as an apology to the emperor through death, though the specific English wordings in circulation vary and deserve caution. At noon on August 15th, 1945, the recorded rescript went out over the radio. Most Japanese had never heard the emperor's voice. The rescript told them the enemy had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. its power to do damage incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. It told them they must endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable, and English renderings vary, so you will also encounter it as bear the unbearable. 2 days later, on August 17th, the rescript to soldiers and sailors cited the Soviet entry. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, and in the interval, the war did not actually stop. Soviet operations continued past August 15th, through the Sakhalin campaign and the Kuril Islands landings, running from August 18th to September 5th. Now we arrive at the argument itself, and the rule from here on is that every position gets presented in its strongest form. The traditionalist or orthodox position holds that the atomic bombs were decisive and shortened the war. Its lineage runs from Herbert Fay's through Robert Newman's Truman and the Hiroshima cult, Robert Maddox. Wilson Miscamble's the most controversial decision, and D.M. Jangreco's work on invasion casualty projections. Its leading modern statement is Richard B. Frank's Downfall, published in 1999. Frank's argument rests on the composition of the Supreme Council. Frank contends that the Japanese military leadership, meaning Anami, Yamazu, and Toyota, remained determined to fight on, and that only the shock of the atomic bomb moved the emperor to intervene. Strip out the bomb, and the deadlock holds. Strip out the bomb, and the 3-against-3 split persists into the autumn, with the war continuing toward Kyushu in November. The most interesting version of the orthodox case, though, comes not from an American historian, but from a Japanese one. Sadao Asada, writing in the Pacific Historical Review in 1998 in an article titled The Shock of the Atomic Bomb and Japan's Decision to Surrender, makes a distinction that reframes the entire question. Asada separates defeat from surrender. Defeat, in Asada's account, was a military fait accompli that had been evident for a long time, since everyone in the Japanese leadership understood the war was lost in any conventional military sense. Surrender is something else entirely, a political act, requiring named men to sign their names to national humiliation and accept personal responsibility for it. The bomb, in Asada's reading, solved a political problem rather than a military one. It handed the Japanese military a way to accept defeat while attributing it to an unprecedented scientific weapon rather than to their own failure. The atomic bomb let the army lose to physics instead of losing to the enemy. Anyone who has watched a large organization abandon a failing project will recognize this mechanism immediately. Projects rarely die when the evidence says they should. Projects die when an external event arrives that lets the people responsible cancel without conceding their judgment was wrong, whether a market shift, a regulatory change, or a technology nobody could have anticipated. The face-saving exit is not a psychological weakness at the margins of institutional behavior. It is frequently the actual mechanism by which institutions change course at all, and Asada's claim is that the atomic bomb functioned as exactly the exit for the Imperial Japanese Army. That is a serious argument, grounded in Japanese sources, made by a Japanese scholar, and it does not depend on the bomb being militarily decisive. It depends on the bomb being politically usable in a way the Soviet invasion was not, because losing Manchuria to the Red Army was a military failure the army owned, while losing to a weapon nobody could have defended against was not. The revisionist position holds that the bombs were unnecessary and that their use was aimed in large part at the Soviet Union rather than at Japan. Its central figure is Gar Alperovitz, whose atomic diplomacy appeared in 1965 and whose the decision to use the atomic bomb followed in 1995. Martin Sherwin's A World Destroyed belongs to the same school. The Alperovitz argument runs like this. Japan was near surrender. The United States knew it from magic, and the single obstacle was the status of the emperor, an obstacle the United States could have removed at any point simply by offering the assurance that Grew, Stimson, and Bard had all argued for. The bomb was used regardless, in large part to intimidate the Soviet Union and shape the post-war order in Europe and Asia. The documentary anchor of the revisionist case is the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's 1946 report, Japan's Struggle to End the War, which concluded that Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated, probably before November 1st, 1945, and certainly before December 31st. That is an extraordinary sentence to find inside an official United States government report published 1 year after the event. And it should not be taken at face value, which is the part most retellings leave out. The survey's conclusion has been attacked on methodological grounds, and the attack is not frivolous. The Strategic Bombing Survey was written partly by Air Force and Navy staff with institutional interests in the outcome. The Army Air Forces had an interest in crediting strategic bombing. The Navy had an interest in crediting the blockade. A conclusion that Japan would have collapsed without the bomb, without the Soviets, and without an invasion happens to credit exactly the two service arms that wrote the report. Critics argue as well that the counterfactual timing, before November 1st, outruns the evidence available to support it. Note carefully what this does to the shape of the debate. The single strongest documentary support for the revisionist position is itself compromised by institutional interest. That does not make it wrong. It makes it a document you have to read the way you would read any organizational self-assessment. One further precision about Alperovitz, since he gets misrepresented in both directions. The Alperovitz focus is American motivation, meaning why the United States used the weapon. Alperovitz does not directly resolve the separate question of what actually moved the Japanese, and those are two different arguments, and collapsing them together is one of the most common errors in popular treatments of this subject. In 2005, Harvard University Press published Racing the Enemy, Stalin, Truman, and the Surrender of Japan by Tsuyoshi Hasegawa. It won the Robert Farrell Award from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations that year, and it reorganized the field. What made the Hasegawa book possible was archival. The opening of Soviet and Russian archives during the 1990s, along with the work of Russian historians, including Boris Slavinsky, allowed a reconstruction of the endgame using American, Soviet, and Japanese sources together rather than sequentially. Previous accounts had been written from one or two of those three archives, and Hasegawa used all three. The Hasegawa framing is a three-way race. Stalin and Truman were each racing to force a Japanese surrender first, on terms favorable to their own post-war position, while Japan raced to find an exit before either of them closed it. His central claim is direct. The Soviet entry into the war played a greater role than the atomic bombs in inducing Japan to surrender, and further, even without the atomic bombs, the war would most likely have ended shortly after Soviet entry, before November 1st. His evidence is the sequence walked through earlier. No Big Six meeting after Hiroshima. A meeting convened after the Soviet invasion. Nagasaki news arriving into a room already in session, with no discernible effect on the discussion. But Hasegawa is more careful than his popular reputation suggests, and this deserves emphasis, since his thesis gets flattened into a slogan constantly. Hasegawa also writes, in a more cautious register, that without the twin shocks of the atomic bombs and Soviet entry, Japan might not have surrendered when it did. Twin shocks, and not one shock. The strong Hasegawa claim concerns relative weight, not the bomb being irrelevant. The most aggressive version of the argument against the bomb's decisiveness comes from Ward Wilson, writing in International Security in 2007 in an article titled The Winning Weapon, Rethinking Nuclear Weapons in Light of Hiroshima. The Wilson argument is the one set up earlier, and it is fundamentally an argument about baselines. Wilson contends that Hiroshima played virtually no role in the Japanese decision, because Japanese leaders had already absorbed the destruction of dozens of cities. 67 cities. More than 300,000 dead by firebombing, on the Conway-Lands calculation. One additional destroyed city was not, within the frame of reference those men were operating in, a categorical change, while the Soviet invasion touched off a crisis. Wilson then takes the argument somewhere more uncomfortable, framing the bomb's decisiveness as a post-war myth that served deterrence theory, a belief that became load-bearing for an entire strategic doctrine, and for that reason was never examined as rigorously as it should have been. There is a formal way to state the Wilson point. In signal detection, the informational value of an event depends on the base rate of similar events. An alarm firing for the first time carries enormous information, while the same alarm firing for the 68th time carries almost none, regardless of how loud it is, because the receiver has already adjusted. Wilson's claim is that Hiroshima arrived into a system saturated with the signal that a Japanese city has been destroyed for 5 straight months, and that the novelty of the delivery mechanism did not restore the informational value repetition had stripped away. The counterargument to Wilson is that the delivery mechanism was the entire point, that one aircraft doing in one instant what previously required hundreds of aircraft over a full night was precisely the categorical change, and that Japanese leaders were sophisticated enough to understand the implication for a defense that had no answer to it, which is where the Asada face-saving argument re-enters, and where the two strongest positions in this debate actually make contact. Racing the enemy did not land without opposition. The H-Diplo Roundtable convened on the book, with contributions from David Holloway, Barton Bernstein, Richard Frank, and others, remains the best single window into the argument, and the Frank contribution is the sharpest. Frank and Robert Maddox challenge Hasegawa's use of sources and his timing claims. The core of the critique is that Hasegawa understates the bomb's role and overreads fragmentary evidence about what actually happened. Inside the August 9th meeting, the claim that Nagasaki news had no effect on the discussion is an inference drawn from an incomplete record rather than a direct observation, and inferences from incomplete records are exactly where a historian's priors do the most work. Frank presses on the counterfactual as well. The Strategic Bombing Survey's conclusion that Japan would have surrendered before November 1st is contested precisely because it is a counterfactual, a claim about a world that never happened. And the Frank positive evidence points the other way, since military leaders including Kawabe, Anami, and Yumizu remained committed to continued war. Hasegawa's rebuttals defend the integration of Russian archival material and hold to the primacy of the Soviet shock. Here is what makes this exchange genuinely difficult rather than merely contentious. Both sides are reading the same documents. Both sides are competent in the relevant languages. Neither side is arguing in bad faith. The disagreement is not about what the sources say. The disagreement concerns what weight to give an absence, meaning the absence of a Big Six meeting after Hiroshima, and how much can be inferred from the internal record of a single meeting held during the collapse of a state. Between the Orthodox and the Soviet decisive positions sits a body of work that is less quotable and arguably closer to the truth. Barton Bernstein's careful assessment resists neat parsing of bomb versus Soviet weight entirely. Bernstein follows a line running back to Robert Buto's Japan's decision to surrender, published in 1954, which concluded that the question could not be fully resolved. 70 years of subsequent archival work has not obviously overturned the Buto judgment. Michael Gordon, in 5 Days in August, adds a point that undercuts both camps. American leaders did not, at the time, regard the atomic bomb as a uniquely war-ending weapon. They expected atomic bombing and conventional bombing to continue together. The idea of the bomb as a categorical break in military history is largely retrospective, assembled after the fact, once the war had ended in a way that made the story available. The synthesis reading is sometimes called the shock of two shocks, treating the bomb and the Soviet entry as jointly necessary, with neither sufficient alone. Strands exist that fall outside the whole bomb versus Soviets frame as well. Japanese language scholarship, including work by Hitano Sumio, Yamada Akira, and Nagai Yanasuke, debates the relative weight of factors and the emperor's actual role. And a distinct argument, developed in the International History Review in 2013, holds that the ruling elite's fear of domestic social revolution, the specter of communist upheaval inside Japan itself, drove the decision to surrender while a state still existed to negotiate on their behalf. Modern accident investigation abandoned the search for the cause decades ago, and the reason is directly relevant here. Investigators found that catastrophic failures are almost never traceable to one factor. They are overdetermined, meaning multiple independent conditions align, and removing any single one might have prevented the outcome, which means no single one can be called the cause. The discipline responded by shifting from root cause language to layered defense models. The bomb versus Soviets debate is structurally identical to a single-cause accident inquiry, and the possibility that has to stay on the table is that the question as posed has no answer, because the event was overdetermined and the counterfactuals cannot be run. Running alongside the causal argument is a second argument that gets confused with it constantly and should not be. The causal question asks what actually ended the war. The counterfactual question asks whether something else could have ended it, sooner or at lower cost, or both. Three alternatives have been argued seriously for 80 years. The first is the one already met, which is to modify the unconditional surrender demand, guaranteeing the imperial institution explicitly and in advance. Joseph Grew, who had been ambassador to Japan, argued for it. Henry Stimson argued for it. Ralph Bard dissented from the prevailing line in the same direction. And the structural case for it is the strongest of the three because it maps directly onto the deadlock inside the Supreme Council. The peace faction of Suzuki, Togo, and Yanai was holding out for exactly one condition. Grant that condition in the Potsdam Declaration, and the 3-against-3 split has a plausible path to resolution without a single additional city being destroyed. The counter is that the Japanese government in July of 1945 was not seeking surrender on one condition. Read Togo's own cable of July 21st, where unconditional surrender could not be accepted in any situation. And the war faction inside the Supreme Council was holding out for 4 conditions rather than one, meaning no occupation, self-disarmament, self-conducted trials, alongside the imperial guarantee. An assurance about the emperor addresses the peace faction's position. It does not obviously move Anami, Yamizu, and Toyota, and under a unanimity requirement, moving the peace faction accomplishes nothing. The second alternative is the demonstration bomb, detonating the weapon over an unpopulated area, inviting observers, letting the demonstration do the work of the destruction. That option carried public support in the immediate aftermath, since the Fortune and Roper survey fielded on November 30th, 1945 found roughly 13.8% of Americans preferring a demonstration first. The objections to it are practical rather than moral. 2 weapons existed, with a third ready to ship on August 12th or 13th according to the Groves memo of August 10th. Spending one of 2 on a demonstration halves the operational stockpile against a leadership actively debating how many bombs the United States possessed and, by some accounts, concluding it could not have many. A demonstration that failed to detonate, or that a skeptical Japanese leadership discounted, would have confirmed exactly the wrong conclusion. The third alternative is the simplest, and it follows directly from the Hasegawa thesis. Wait. Stalin had committed at Yalta to enter the war 3 months after the German surrender. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The arithmetic was available to anyone in Washington who cared to do it. Wait until August 8th, let the Soviet declaration land, and watch what the Supreme Council does. Marshall himself raised something adjacent to this at the June 18th meeting, speculating that Soviet entry might be the decisive action levering Japan into capitulation. That speculation sits in the record from the Army Chief of Staff 7 weeks before Hiroshima. Richard Frank's response to all of this is the one that has to be reckoned with, and it is not primarily about the bombs at all. The Frank counter is that none of the 3 alternatives guaranteed a faster end, and that the assumption underneath the entire counterfactual exercise is that the war was otherwise static, that while diplomats redrafted declarations and physicists staged demonstrations and planners waited for Stalin, nothing else was happening. Nothing else was not happening. The blockade remained in place. In a country the Strategic Bombing Survey described as totally dependent on imported fuel, where survey staff recorded that people were starving. The firebombing campaign was still running, with tonnage having climbed from 13,800 tons in March to 42,700 tons in July. 67 cities had been hit. Every week of delay carried its own casualty figure, distributed across a Japanese civilian population, and that figure appears in none of the counterfactuals, because nobody counted the deaths a shorter war prevented. That is the hardest version of the orthodox argument, and it does not require the bomb to have been decisive. It only requires the war to have been lethal while it continued. Everything so far has been an argument about causation. A separate argument exists, and conflating the two has confused this subject for 80 years. The causal question asks whether the bomb ended the war. The moral and legal question asks whether its use was justified. Those questions are independent. A weapon can be decisive and unjustified. A weapon can be justified and militarily marginal. Answering one does not answer the other, and most public arguments about Hiroshima slide between them without noticing. Leahy's position, whatever its reliability as a contemporaneous objection, is a moral position rather than a causal one. The Leahy memoir claims the bomb was of no material assistance, which is causal, but the passage giving it force is the other clause, that in being first to use the weapon the United States had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. That sentence does not depend on whether the bomb ended the war. It would stand if the bomb had ended the war on the first morning. Truman's own contemporaneous record is worth reading against this, because it is not the record of a man who thought he was doing what he was doing. In his Potsdam Diary entry of July 25, 1945, Truman wrote that they had discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. In the same entry, Truman recorded that the target would be a purely military one, and that he had instructed Stimson to aim at military objectives and soldiers and sailors, not women and children. Hold that against what was actually done. The targets were cities. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were urban centers whose civilian populations made up the overwhelming majority of the casualties, a fact reflected in every casualty range quoted so far, from the 110,000 low group total to the 210,000 high group total. We are not going to adjudicate that gap, and the honest reason is that the gap admits several readings, all of them held by serious people. It can be read as self-deception in a man who had been president for 3 months. It can be read as a private diary written for an imagined future reader. It can be read as reflecting the categories of 1945, in which Hiroshima's military installations made it a military target under the operative doctrine, and in which 67 cities had already burned under exactly that reasoning without producing this kind of entry. What the entry establishes without ambiguity is that the president who authorized the weapon recorded, on paper, a description of its intended use that does not match the use. That is the moral debate. It sits alongside the causal debate. It does not resolve it, and it is not resolved by it. There is one more piece of this to handle, because it has shaped public understanding more than any scholarly argument ever has. You have heard that the atomic bombs saved 1 million American lives. Look at what American planners actually believed in the summer of 1945. At the White House meeting on June 18, 1945, attended by Truman, Leahy, Marshall, King, Eaker standing in for Arnold, Stimson, Forrestal, and McCloy, General Marshall estimated that first 30-day casualties on Kyushu would not exceed those suffered on Luzon. The Luzon figure was approximately 31,000. Marshall also told Truman that Kyushu was expected to be defended by roughly 350,000 Japanese troops, which was a serious underestimate. Marshall said something else at that meeting worth noting given everything covered here. Marshall speculated that Soviet entry might be the decisive action levering Japan into capitulation. Other contemporaneous estimates ran as follows. Nimitz's staff projected roughly 49,000 casualties in the first 30 days of Olympic. MacArthur's staff projected roughly 105,000 to 125,000 over 120 days. Admiral Leahy's figure came to around 268,000 casualties. Those are the numbers in the room when Olympic was approved. The famous figures arrived later. A study commissioned by Stimson and conducted by Quincy Wright and William Shockley projected 1.7 to 4 million American casualties, including 400,000 to 800,000 dead and 5 to 10 million Japanese dead across the full invasion. Note the provenance carefully, because popular sources blur it constantly. The 1.7 to 4 million figure comes from the post-war Shockley study. It is not the operational planning figure that guided the June 18th decision. That figure was approximately 31,000 casualties in the first 30 days. The million lives claim entered American public memory through a specific document at a specific moment. In February of 1947, Stimson published an article in Harper's titled The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. It was a deliberate intervention, written to settle public doubt. and it cemented the million lives figure in the American understanding of the war. What Stimson executed in 1947 is a recognizable communications operation, and naming it plainly requires no assumption of bad faith. An institution facing reputational exposure over a decision publishes an authoritative first-person account from the most credible available insider, framed around a single memorable number, released early enough to become the reference point before competing accounts organize. Any modern communications professional would recognize the structure and would call it well executed. It worked. 80 years later, the number from that article is still what most people know about this subject, and the number from the June 18th meeting is not. The same caution applies in the opposite direction, and it has to be applied evenly. Admiral Leahy wrote in his 1950 memoir, "I was there that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in the war against Japan, that the Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and successful conventional bombing, and that in being first to use it, the United States had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages." That is a devastating passage, and it gets quoted constantly. Barton Bernstein's observation about it is that Leahy raised no such objection before Hiroshima. It is a post-war recollection. Eisenhower's case is weaker still. In Mandate for Change, published in 1963, and in a 1963 interview, Eisenhower said he had told Stimson the bomb was completely unnecessary and that Japan was seeking to surrender with a minimum loss of face. Scholars, including Bernstein, questioned the reliability of that recollection. No contemporaneous 1945 record corroborates a formal Eisenhower objection, and the circumstances Eisenhower described are themselves problematic. Apply the standard evenly, and the result turns uncomfortable for everyone. The million lives figure is a post-war construction. The most quoted American objections to the bomb are also post-war constructions. Both sides of this argument have been leaning on memory rather than documents. And memory in 1947 and 1950 and 1963 had reasons of its own. Every argument covered here has been conducted at the level of 6 men in Tokyo and a handful more in Washington and Moscow. The consequences were never distributed that way. Over 80,000 Koreans were in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, many of them forced laborers. Estimates give roughly 20,000 Korean deaths at Hiroshima, about 1 in 5 of the victims, according to figures reported by the World. Combined Korean deaths across both cities are estimated at roughly 40 to 50,000, with some sources putting the figure above 50,000, out of approximately 215,000 total deaths. By the end of 1945, every one of those figures is explicitly a rough estimate. The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons noted in 2025 that no proper investigation has ever been conducted. Japan contributed 4 billion yen in 1993 toward the Hapcheon Atomic Bomb Victim Welfare Center in South Korea. Consider what that means as a matter of historical record. Tens of thousands of colonial subjects, brought to Japan under compulsion, were killed by a weapon aimed at the empire that had brought them there, and 80 years later nobody can say with confidence how many. They sit inside the casualty ranges quoted throughout this account, invisible in the aggregate. On the mainland, the Soviet offensive produced a civilian catastrophe of its own. Approximately 1.5 million Japanese civilian settlers were in Manchuria when the Guandong Army collapsed. What followed was a refugee disaster, with widespread civilian death, rape, and looting reported during and after the Soviet advance. Then came the internment. Estimates of Japanese personnel taken by the Soviets run from 560,000 to 760,000, with some estimates as high as 900,000. The Japanese government's own estimate is roughly 575 to 577,000 transferred, with roughly 55,000 deaths. Death estimates vary enormously by source, from around 60,000 in Soviet-certified figures up to 347,000 in the American historian William F. Nimmo's estimate, which includes 254,000 dead and 93,000 missing. Other sources give 200,000 to 300,000. Repatriation dragged on until 1956, 11 years. Men who surrendered in August of 1945 were still coming home in 1956. Chinese and Manchurian civilians, comfort women, and other colonial subjects across the empire were caught in the same collapse. Allied prisoners of war held in Japan and across the occupied territories stood at acute risk throughout the endgame, and the surrender arrangements specifically required Japan to move prisoners and internees to places of safety. The Soviet operations also did not end when the emperor spoke. The Sakhalin and Kuril operations ran from August 18th to September 5th, past the moment the war is conventionally said to have stopped. The debate described here has never been purely academic in either country, and the fight over public memory has at times run fiercer than the fight over evidence. The clearest demonstration came in 1995. The National Air and Space Museum planned an exhibition for the 50th anniversary incorporating critical scholarship, including the lower invasion casualty estimates drawn from Barton Bernstein's research. Opposition from the American Legion and the Air Force Association was intense. On January 30th, 1995, Secretary Michael Heyman canceled the full exhibit, stating that a mistake had been made. Director Martin Harwit resigned in May. The replacement display showed the fuselage with minimal context. That is what happened when the scholarly argument met public memory directly. The scholarship lost. The polling data traces the underlying shift across 8 decades. Gallup, on August 26, 1945, found 85% of Americans approving of using the bombs, 10% disapproving, and 5% with no opinion. A Fortune and Roper survey fielded on November 30, 1945 found roughly 53.5% saying the United States had used the bombs as it should have, roughly 22.7% wishing more had been used before Japan could surrender, roughly 13.8% preferring a demonstration first, and under 5% opposed outright. Gallup in 2005, at the 60th anniversary, found 57% approving and 38% disapproving, with a sharp gender gap of 73% of men against 42% of women, and a partisan gap of 73, 53, and 47% across party lines. Pew Research Center in 2015, at the 70th anniversary, found 56% of Americans saying the use of nuclear weapons was justified and 34% saying it was not. In Japan, 14% said the bombing was justified against 79% who said it was not. 7 in 10 Americans aged 65 and over said the use was justified, against 47% of those aged 18 to 29. And 73% of Americans said the United States should not apologize. Pew again in 2025, at the 80th anniversary, fielded June 2nd to 8th, found 35% of Americans saying the bombing was justified, 31% saying it was not, and a third saying they were not sure. Handle that last comparison carefully. The 2025 figures are not directly comparable to 2015, because the 2015 survey did not include an explicit not sure option. What the 2025 numbers show unambiguously is that a third of Americans now decline to render a verdict at all. On October 11, 2024, the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to Neon Hidenkyo, the Japan Confederation of A and H bomb sufferers organizations, founded on August 10, 1956. The citation recognized its efforts toward a world free of nuclear weapons and its demonstration, through witness testimony, that nuclear weapons must never be used again. The committee added that it wished to honor all survivors who, despite physical suffering and painful memories, had chosen to use their costly experience to cultivate hope and engagement for peace. The ceremony was held in Oslo on December 10, 2024. 79 years after the bombing, the people who survived it were still doing the work of testimony. So return to where this started. August 15, 1945, and the emperor tells the Japanese people the war has ended because of a new and most cruel bomb. August 17, 1945, and the same emperor tells the Japanese armed forces the war has ended because of the Soviet entry. Both statements came from Hirohito. Both were official. Both were true in the sense that mattered to the audience each was written for, and neither was the whole account, because there may not be a whole account to give. What the evidence supports is narrower than any of the confident versions. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War did not meet after Hiroshima and did meet after the Soviet invasion. Nagasaki reached that meeting after it had already convened. 67 Japanese cities had already been destroyed, and more than 300,000 people had already been killed by fire, without producing surrender. The one condition the Japanese peace faction needed was the one the Potsdam Declaration declined to state. The Guangdong Army had built its defense on a Soviet neutrality that ended at midnight, and Anami Korechika, Yamizu Yashijiro, and Toyota Somo, the three men whose consent the entire structure required, gave it in the week both shocks arrived, and gave no clean account of which one moved them. Richard Frank reads that record and finds a bomb that broke a deadlock. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa reads it and finds a Soviet declaration that destroyed a strategy. Sadao Asada reads it and finds an army that needed a weapon it could lose to without dishonor. Ward Wilson reads it and finds a myth that outlived its evidence. Barton Bernstein and Robert Buto read it and decline to choose. 80 years of archival work across 3 languages has produced no verdict, and the reason is not that the historians have been careless. The reason is that the world only ran the experiment once, and it ran it with both variables, changed inside the same 72 hours. The comfortable versions of August 1945, meaning the bomb that ended the war, the bomb that was never needed, the mistranslated word, and the million lives saved, all share a single quality. Each of them is simpler than the documents. The documents describe 6 men in a locked room, a country already burned to the ground, an ally that had become an enemy overnight, an ambassador in Moscow who had seen it all coming and been ignored, and a decision that had to be unanimous in a body that could not agree. That is the surrender, not a cause, but a convergence, and the honest position, the one the evidence will actually bear, is that we know what happened in those 8 days far better than we know why.